seated. There's a principle for reading the Bible, or parts of it anyway, quite a few parts, which I'd like to suggest to you this morning, which has particular bearing on our gospel reading that Nancy just read from Matthew chapter 25. There's a tendency when we read Bible stories, particularly Jesus' parables, there's a temptation when they're couched in terms of a division between types or characters or people in the story. There's a temptation to see that as an invitation to look out at the world and divide the world up into those who are in one category and those who are in the other category. So this morning, in our gospel reading, we have a story of 10 bridesmaids who are waiting patiently for the groom to arrive so that when the groom arrives, they can all together go into the wedding banquet. They can joyously celebrate this magical moment and join together in a great, momentous celebration. But the story goes, there are 5 of these bridesmaids who have brought adequate oil for their lamps, and 5 who have not brought an adequate supply of oil to keep their lamps lit. In order to go into the banquet, you need a lamp that will sustain you through, continue to burn through the course of the celebration. So when the bridegroom shows up, the 5 bridesmaids who have brought an inadequate supply of oil for their lamps are forced to run off into the village to find more oil to keep their lamps burning through the banquet. And when they return, the doors are shut and they are left on the outside. And the parable calls those 2 groups, the wise bridesmaids on the one hand, those who brought an adequate supply of oil for their lamps, and the foolish bridesmaids on the other hand, who brought an inadequate supply of oil for their lamps. So the temptation here, and what I don't want you to do, the temptation here is to look at this parable as an invitation to look out at the world and say, oh, there's that group of foolish bridesmaids. And here with us is the group of wise bridesmaids. Usually when we divide, we tend to put ourselves in the more favorable of the 2 categories. And so you lump the world up into those foolish Democrats over there who think they've won the election, and those wise Republicans over here who know that the truth will come out and the real President of the United States will soon be known. Or you look at people you know and care about, and you say, well, they're obviously, they never go to church, so they're in the foolish category, and I go to Zoom every Sunday faithfully, so I'm obviously in the wise category. Don't do that, okay? Let's just agree that we won't look at the Bible as dividing the world up into people like them who are out and don't make the grade, and people like us who are in and do make the grade. Instead, what I'd like you to do in looking at this passage and most passages of the Bible is I'd like you to try to see the whole story as a picture of yourself. You are this story. I am this story. This story is an illustration, as most stories in the Bible are, is an illustration of my inner life. The fact of the matter is that I am sometimes a wise bridesmaid. But the reality is, at other times, I am a foolish bridesmaid. I'm both. And I go back and forth between the one and the other. And I'd be willing to bet that you probably do too. I may not be alone in embracing both foolish and wise within myself. So what the important question then to ask this story is, what is it that makes the difference between when I'm able to come from a wise place within myself and when instead I come from a foolish place within myself? And I think the answer to that question, it runs throughout the story, but I think the answer is summed up at the very end. When Jesus says at the end of this parable, "Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." I am wise when I keep awake. So what does it mean to keep awake? Well, I don't know about you, but normally when I'm asleep, I have my eyes closed. When I have my eyes closed, I am not able physically to see what is going on around me. I am foolish when I refuse to see clearly. I am wise when I am awake, alert, paying attention, willing to see, not just see what's going on around me, but even more, to see what's going on inside of me. And the thing, it's ironic, the thing that prevents that from happening is the very thing I warned you against at the beginning of what I was saying. The thing that prevents me from seeing is when I divide the world or myself up into categories, into differences. When I say of myself, "Oh, gee, I really like this, and I really want to be that, but I really don't like this about myself. I really don't want to be that." Or I really like this attitude or this behavior, and I really want to maximize that, but I really don't like this, and I really want to get rid of that. When I do that to myself, I stop looking, I stop seeing clearly. I become unwilling to embrace the whole of who I in fact am, because the reality is, for my entire life, I have fluctuated back and forth between wise and stupid. And I need to be willing to see that about myself. We are all both. There's a movie that I watched a little while ago. Some of you may have heard of it. I swore I'd never mention it again. Sorry, I won't mention it next week. I don't think I'm even speaking next week. David, are you on next week? I think so, hopefully. Don't talk about the movie, okay? So there's a moment in A Hidden Life, about an hour into the film, where Franz Jägerstätter, the young Austrian peasant farmer who has refused to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler and who is going to be executed, there's a moment in it where he describes a dream. It's actually really a nightmare that he's had, and it's a real dream, and it informed everything that it informed all of his decisions from that point on. And the dream was a dream of a massive steam locomotive hurtling down the track. And he could see that it was going at a dangerous speed and it was headed towards a dangerous place. And all along the tracks, people were leaping onto the train. They were joining onto this train. He says children, women, men, they were all flocking to get on board this train. And of course, he recognized as soon as he woke up that the train was an emblem or an image or a vision or a symbol for him of Nazism. That this great destructive force was careening down the tracks, heading towards a horrific and painful place. So his dream is a vision of all the horror that is about to unfold. And I think it's an appropriate vision for us to reflect on this as we move into the week of Remembrance Day on Wednesday. Because we know, if we know anything about war at all, we know that regardless of who's on the right side, who's on the wrong side, we know that it always brings horror, pain, suffering, tragedy, and brokenness. And it's very tempting in war to see the world divided up into those who are on my side and those who are my enemies. The President-elect of the United States of America, Mr. Joe Biden, said 2 days ago, we have to stop treating our opponents as enemies. We have to stop treating our opponents as enemies. I think there's a danger that he may have been reading the New Testament and actually taking it to heart. And what happens in A Hidden Life, that dream that Franz Jägerstätter recounts, the dream of the train, it's immediately followed by Terrence Malick, the director, cutting away from the current situation that he's filming and inserting into his film a very short clip that's historically real, that's in color, some of the very rare footage from in color in those days of home movies. And the home movie that, in this case, was filmed by Eva Braun. And it's taking place on the balcony outside the Berghof in the Obersalzberg, Hitler's vacation home. And in this film, you see a very pleasant-looking man playing with a very adorable-looking little girl, beautifully dressed in a lovely skirt. And she comes to him very trusting. He puts his hand out and shakes her hand and pats her on the head. And it's a lovely vision of a sweet uncle playing with a lovely little child. Except we all know, as soon as we see the clip, of course, that the sweet uncle is the very man who is entirely responsible for that dark, foreboding train that was hurtling down the tracks, leading much of the world to death, destruction, pain, and suffering. And I think what Terrence Malick wants us to see in that coming together of images is that we all have within us both wise bridesmaids and foolish bridesmaids. And there is no one in the world who is totally just one or the other. And it's when we open to that reality that we discover that we are in fact brought into, invited into this extraordinary celebration that is the force of life, that is the power of life, that is embodied in or symbolized by this wedding celebration that Jesus spoke about. Earlier this week, as I was thinking about speaking on this wedding banquet and this passage, Naomi, our daughter, texted me a picture that Eleanor, our youngest granddaughter, 4 years old, had drawn. And Naomi didn't quite know precisely what this picture was. But just so you can think about it too, Larry's going to put it up on the screen for you to look at. So Naomi asked Ellie, so what's this picture about? So think about this. This is this past week, the week in which I'm going to speak on the foolish bridesmaids and the wise bridesmaids at the wedding banquet. So what is this picture about? It's a picture, Ellie said, of God's wedding. Now, you probably didn't know God was married, but apparently God is married. And I want you to notice that this bride is wearing a crown, and the crown has a veil. And this bride has long brown braids and a cape, the little brown sweeping cape around, hanging down from God's shoulders. And this God has wings, the little red things sticking out from behind God are wings. And this God has magnificent red dancing shoes. But what I really want you to see in this image, or what I really see in this image, is that there's an energy to it. There's a force that I feel when I look at this image. There's a kind of vitality that comes out of this, comes off the page from this 4-year-old portrait of God's wedding. And that's the banquet that you're invited into. And that's the banquet that we get to join when we're willing to embrace all of life. The dark side, the light side, the good, the bad, the foolish, the wise. When we're able within our hearts to find a place for those we may think of as enemies, as well as those we think of as loved ones. It's when we're able within our hearts to open the door of the banquet of life to everything, to all that is, and to take it all in and to embrace it all. It's then that we discover within ourselves that energy field that informs, it seems to me, this little image of God's wedding. So don't use this parable to divide the world up and to shun the parts you don't like. The dark side of life has an energy. It has a vitality that we need to be willing to see. And we need to be willing to take into ourselves and turn towards the light and the truth and the goodness and the beauty of light of God. And it's when we do that that we are drawn into the fullness of life and the vitality and energy of God's wisdom, purity, and goodness and truth. Amen.
God